Now let's look at each of these terms turn by turn. So, what did Plato mean by poetic inspiration? I'm quoting from one of his very noteworthy works, Ion, in fact. And here he says, for the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he has been inspired and is out of his senses, and his mind is no longer in him. When he has not attended to this state, he is powerless and is unable to utter his oracles. So these lines obviously imply that Plato considers poetry as a result of divine inspiration. He does not think that the poet is uh, a work of poetry or a work like an epic or a drama is involves any kind of skill or craft. He looks at it as a manifestation of the divine, because Plato comes from a school of thought which believes that God speaks through the poet. So when God is exercising his agency and using the poet as a medium, obviously the poet is in an unconscious state, right? And it is not the poet who is speaking, but it's God who is speaking. And that is why Plato describes the poet as light and winged and holy, because he is kind of God's voice. And there is no invention in him until he has been inspired. So a poet can create, a poet can invent only when the poet is adequately, reasonably inspired, and uh, this is very important, is out of his senses. So a poet in his right state of mind can never compose, can never create. And this is the argument that Plato builds on. And a poet needs to be outside of his mind in order to make something beautiful, in order to create something beautiful. And when he is not attained to this state, that is, if he is not in this state, he is powerless. So poetry is like an oracle, it's like a mystery, it's like a divine epiphanic moment. And here Plato also goes on to compare poets with prophets, prophets who can see things, who have visions, and who speak the divine truth. Plato compares poets to prophets, and he categorically says that poetry is not a craft, it is not an art, it is not a skill, but it is a moment. It's a revelation, it's an epiphanic moment. And he does not give any credit to the poet for that, because he believes, he assumes that God is speaking through the poet, and the poet has got nothing to do with his work. And the poet is a medium of God's utterance. So poetry, therefore, becomes not rational but impulsive. The poet is in a particular state of mind. So he's, in fact, not even in his own senses when he is creating poetry. Therefore, the poet could not be thinking rationally when he creates poetry, and as a result of which, Plato very logically infers that poetry is irrational, it is impulsive, it is written in a moment of frenzy, it is written in a moment of ecstasy, it is written in a moment when the poet has some kind of the poet is divinely intoxicated, like maybe he's in a state of inebriation. He's like in a drunken state, and it's not a thought out thing, it's not a well conceived, well thought out, planned thing, right? And therefore poetry is unreliable because it is not a result of conscious judgment. And also the kind of divine truths poetry posits or proclaims to convey is beyond the understanding, it is beyond the comprehension of ordinary mortals, and therefore it's actually of very little relevance to ordinary people. It is of very little relevance to readers. And poetry, therefore, should not be taken as a discipline. It is just God's word.